All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to HBAP Startups. My name is Todd Browse. I'm here with Susan Schultz. We are your hosts for the evening. For those of you who are new to the Startups group, we have a few announcements at the beginning of each meeting. We do some short networking breakout rooms, and then after that, we'll come back together for our main event. And first off is our mission. We are here to help foster and fortify an innovation and entrepreneur community coming out of the Harvard Business Analytics program. Our goal is to provide our members with the tools, knowledge, leadership, and confidence necessary to create and grow their businesses from the ground up. You're probably wondering how to engage with us, so I'm going to post a couple of links in the Zoom chat. For those of you who are HBAPers, we post frequently in the entrepreneurship Slack group. If you're not an HBAPer and you want to become an HBAPer, go to analytics.hbs.edu and you can apply to become an HBAPer. And there's a good chance that you'll get in. We have a newsletter, so please fill out the link. Here's the links to our newsletter so we can newsletter you. And we also have a website, hbapstartups.com, where you can take a look at a lot of the content that we've amassed over the years. And recordings will be posted when possible. We are in the process of moving everything over to YouTube. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but we're doing it. Next slide. Susan.
Yes. So, we have this group here really to create a space and a time where we can hear amazing things, talk about amazing things, talk about painful things, share our ideas, get feedback, all of that kind of stuff. So our code of conduct is really creating this environment of collaboration and ensuring confidentiality and, of course, trusting each other. And so to that end, all rights are reserved by the presenter unless they tell us otherwise. We, of course, follow all of the honor codes that we've all signed up for. And as always, we adhere to the Francis Fry's 5-to-1 ratio on feedback, so which is then modified by Kelly, and I will get to that. So Francis is for every one piece of spicy tart feedback, you give 5 pieces of sweet and awesome feedback, because that research shows is the best way to give feedback. Now, Kelly's modification, which is no spicy tartness, just sweetness all the way through. And so just to close it up, if anybody's concerned about confidentiality or conflict of interest, just reach out to Todd and me and we will help you figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. Welcome new folks. Are there any new faces here? Let me look around. If you want to introduce yourself and give us a 10-second intro, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. But I think most of the people here know everybody else. So
I know, who's this Divs person?
Oh yeah, who is Divs? Divya. We know Divya. All right. So I'm going to move on. Upcoming next week, we've got Tracy Warren, another one of Kelly's heroes from F5 Collective. Then Dolly Singh, another one of Kelly's heroes. Allison Byers, most of the people here know who Allison is. She is the CEO at Scroobius. She's presented here a couple of times and in the Startups Academy. She will be back on March 22nd for yet another spectacular presentation. And there's going to be another announcement related to that upcoming. March 29th, workshop series, De-risking the Business Model. Is that the right title, Susan?
That's a great title. And it could always change, but that's what it is right now.
That's the current working title, De-risking the Business Model. Yeah. And then most importantly, this coming Sunday, we are going to be continuing our pitch feedback sessions for our very own Susan Schultz from TeamStack. So I will be posting everywhere the Zoom link for that. I'll send out another newsletter. But if you are around and you've got nothing else, you please come on Sunday. Schedule it. We need your feedback.
Yeah, and this is the same thing that that Gordon did last weekend, because he got into the New York version of this same pitch competition. Satya and I got into the Boston version of it, semifinalists, and then Kelly knows somebody in Melbourne that also got into it. So all these really cool ideas. So would love it. Any of you that want to come and help us perfect our pitch. We asked for and then got feedback from the judges. And so I'll start with that to show you all like what are they looking for and how well are we giving them what they're looking for.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, so let's do some breakout rooms. These are randomly selected. I have no idea, but let's see if this works. 5 minutes on the countdown, so you'll be back in about 6. If you don't get assigned to a room, hang out with me in the lobby and we can be good friends. All right, I will see you guys in a few. And I'm going to pause the recording.
Recording in progress.
Let me mute folks. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you. I hope you had fun in your breakout rooms. Before I forget, just as a little reminder, there will be a survey that shows up at the end. After you exit Zoom, please fill out that survey. We are data analytics people, and without data, we become distraught, sad, and lost, which I think Nicole will address later. So remember, filling out surveys saves lives. And after we're done, we will stop recording. Please do stick around for some overtime. We love to continue the conversation without the session being recorded. And so now let's get started. Folks, it is my honor to introduce our speaker for the evening. Nicole Gibson is a modern-day philosopher redefining what it means to be an entrepreneur. Obsessed by love's power to effect change, Nicole's focus is to facilitate a tipping point in human consciousness, to successfully actualize a civilization of love by 2030. Combining the intersections of visionary technology, transformative arts, and complex systems thinking, Nicole is building a bridge to an entirely new way of living and being for all of humanity. While leading events and facilitating experiences for over 1 million people, Nicole identified a code that unlocked humanity's greatest potential, spanning from the establishment of a charitable organization to becoming the youngest Commonwealth Commissioner in history, to launching a social movement with a reach across 40 countries. Nicole's main preoccupation is to leverage love's power to transform and scale it to 350 million people globally. Listed as Australia's top 100 most influential women, finalist for Young Australian of the Year, and a Pride of Australia medalist, our next speaker is just getting started. Now, without further ado, if we could all please briefly unmute ourselves, and let's give a warm round of applause to Nicole Gibson. Nicole, I hope that was good. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, what a beautiful introduction, and so warming to know that in preparation you started to read Love Out Loud, which really that book in so many ways, which had its birthday on Valentine's Day actually. So yeah, it was such a monumental kind of transition in my entrepreneurial journey. So thank you, and thank you, Kelly, so much for introducing me to this community. Thank you for believing in me. Liz, congratulations on your fantastic opportunity. And Divya, great to see you as well. And I hope all of us become friends over the next 90 minutes, because that's really what this is all about. Love's power to change the world is in understanding that first and foremost, the human condition is anchored in this mutual and shared desire to be seen and heard. So any opportunity, you know, where community comes together to see each other, to hear each other, to listen to each other's ideas. I know this from working in the pits of community all the way through the top levels of government. It's that ethos that really does change the world, no matter how big or small, no matter how well-funded or not well-funded any idea is. That's really so central. Yeah, so congratulations to all of you for the amazing work you're doing. Before I jump into my talk, I'd love to honor the traditional owners of the land in which I'm meeting here in Australia, and pay respects to elders past and present, and also extend that to any of the lands in which you're all meeting as well. And where to begin? You know, I was excited for this talk, because I know all of you have such intellectual capacity to change the world. So where do you begin, you know, sharing an ethos like Love Out Loud with Harvard community, and I asked Kelly, what's the one thing that you feel, I could sort of share with this community to really add the most value. And Kelly was sharing with me that he's been encouraging all of you to take the jump. And yeah, I think my life has maybe definitely qualified me to speak on this topic. And the story I wanted to begin with is actually a story of taking a literal jump and what that taught me about the nature of fear and love, because at the core of Love Out Loud's ethos, we teach that there's these two choices all of us are making, the choice between love and fear. And a neuroscientist will tell you that we make about 35,000 choices a day, which to me sounds overwhelming, complex, and probably very difficult to get conscious control of. But to simplify it down to just these two understandings and pathways in life, I know for me has changed the trajectory of my life. And I know for many of our community around the world, it's provided a frame and a starting point to begin changing their lives in a direction that's more unified, connected, expansive, revolutionary, creative, because that's what love's nature really is, right? When you think about love, let me ask your hands up if you've ever fallen in love before. You're academic, so I'm only expecting maybe 50% of you. I'm just kidding. Hopefully all of you in one way or another, whether that's, love for a person romantically, or maybe it's a love for a project, or love for family, love for, one of your heroes in the world. I think all of us have experienced love's true force. And so my next question there is, was that experience of love, especially maybe a reference you have to falling in love, quite literally with another person, was it a rational experience in any way? Some of you are nodding, most of you are shaking your head. I would say, in my experience, love is definitely not rational. And I think for this reason, we fear it because we want to be in control. Because being in control allows us to have a sense of security in our lives and in the world, and a sense of predictability around what's happening next. Keeping in mind, our evolutionary kind of function was to keep us in a state of insecurity, quite literally within security, because the unknown could have meant potential death. So love's very nature threatens this so deeply. And yet when we look at some of the most fundamental challenges that we're facing as a world, in Love Out Loud's case, it's ensuring that we have health systems that can really support the demands of its citizens moving forward, and the cultural implications of the division that we're seeing, I think, in our world. But really any great challenge, whether that be climate crisis, whatever your passion is, there's a level of irrational belief, there's a level of irrational dreaming and thinking required. And what I mean by that is belief that a universe can exist beyond our current conditions. That by nature has a level of irrationality, and visionary minds, I think, have a connection to the future. I know for myself, I've always tended to live in the future. I've lived in that possibility. And as I started to walk my path deeper and deeper, I started to realize it was in fact because I was in love so deeply with that vision of the world, that idea that we could have a harmonized world, that kindness could actually lead as a part of our culture, that compassion could be an integrated force behind our choices and actions, that propelled me to take these jumps. And in 2016, I was deciding whether or not to continue my my term as a federal commissioner. And leading up to that point in my journey, I felt like I had really seen quite two strong polarities of the space that I was working in at the time, which was specifically mental health, starting a charitable foundation at 18 years old and working in communities could not have been more grassroots in the way that I was approaching that change at the time, bringing people together in community and hearing their stories all the way through to top levels of government. And I can share in a little bit how that journey unfolded. But I found myself at this crossroads, potentially a bit of a quarter-life crisis, who knows, deciding where I felt my attention and focus and experience, and what I discovered working with thousands of people and hearing their stories was best spent. So I decided to go on this soul-searching trip, as one would do. I took 7 kilos of luggage in a backpack and started to go on this journey to drown out the noise and decide what I was going to do next. And I was 3 months into the trip, and I started to feel like it was probably time for me to go home and make some pretty important decisions. And I felt like there was still this fear that I wasn't facing. And that was maybe largely because I had experienced quite a level of success at a young age, and changing your life in a radical way when you already have foundations, where you're being recognized for something, where you've built a level of security, especially as an entrepreneur. I feel like just the second you build security, there's this itch in you that starts to annoyingly tell you that there's more, there's bigger, there's greater impact that you can create. But on the journey, so often you're sort of convincing yourself, when I get to this place where it's stable and secure, then I'll kind of rest on my laurels, at least for a period of time. So I've never found that to be the dominant voice in my journey. So I took a final short trip to the jungle in Costa Rica, and I was hiking this trail, deep in thought, and sort of asking myself and the universe, whatever you believe in, I'd like to face this really innate fear that I feel, because I feel like there's this truth inside of me that I'm meant to do something bigger than all of this. But what could possibly be bigger than being the youngest federal commissioner in history? What could possibly be bigger than that? My logical mind, my rational mind didn't understand, but I could feel that it was there. And as I was in this deep contemplation, this young man from Madrid was walking behind me, and he caught up to me and he started making conversation. And I was sort of thinking, like, I just wish this guy would leave me alone. I've got some deep soul searching and inquiry to do. I don't really want to be in this conversation. And he was telling me all about his life in Spain, and how he manufactured beverages. And after maybe like 30 minutes of not drawing breath, he said, "What do you do?" And that was probably the most triggering question anyone could have asked me in that moment. What do you do? And I took a long pause and I said, "Brother, I'm in the business of helping people overcome fear and live a life that they love." And then he stopped in his tracks, and he was so excited. And I was like, what's going on? And he said, "I've been waiting to find someone that was going to do the bungee jump with me at the end of this trail. And I can't believe this is what you do for a living. You're the perfect person to do this with me." And I think in that moment, I momentarily stopped breathing, because the irony is, as someone that's relatively fearless, my biggest, probably more than a fear, more like a phobia, is heights, right? And so the irony of the manifestation in that moment was really all consuming. And I started to backpedal, right? I was like, no. Like, the way I help people overcome fear is a little bit different to a bungee jump, mate. Like, I help people sort of change their mindset and have vulnerable conversations and face the parts of their belief systems that are difficult to overcome. And he was just not buying it. His face was had it written all over that I was some kind of imposter for not seeing the parallels in my lack of enthusiasm to do the bungee jump with him. And so I was rationalizing and justifying my position, and basically concluded and said, "I'm not going to do this bungee jump with you," is the final point here. And then he took a long pause and he sighed. We breathed deeply and he sighed. And then he said, "Nicole, when you get people to step onto the edges of their belief systems, when you get them to share something with the world that they've never shared before, or you invite them to feel something that's been repressed, that's equally as terrifying and no different to you stepping on the precipice of that bungee jump and taking a leap. So you either need to do this bungee jump with me, or you really need to reconsider your job when you go back to Australia. And I was just standing there, you know, all muddy, probably hadn't showered for several days, just really feeling like the universe had knocked me to my knees. And I said to him, look, that's probably the only sequence of words anyone in the entire world could have said to me right now that would have actually made it impossible for me to say no to this invitation. So it looks like I'm doing this bungee jump with you. And we get to the end of the trail, and I just feel completely paralyzed in fear. I don't know if any of you have ever felt something similar to that, maybe not a bungee jump, but maybe taking the action that's really scary to take. And just to really tease me, the universe didn't really give me like a first world version of a bungee jump, right? This was like this is the developing countries version of a bungee jump, which was a platform that was put together basically, but with two poles in between two mountains and a valley, and a platform where they literally pulled you out into the middle of the valley, and from there you took the leap. And I got onto the platform when it was my turn, and I just remember thinking, I actually don't know how I'm going to physically force myself to do this. I felt so exposed and so terrified and so vulnerable. And the operations guy that was on the platform with me proceeded to put Velcro around my ankles. And I was thinking, like, that cannot be safe, you know, like, can we get some like metal rods or something a bit more sturdy? And I was holding his shoulder and I was physically shaking. And I said to him, has anyone ever died doing this? And he said in broken English, I'll tell you after. And I said, that's probably for the best, you know. And so the platform stopped, and there was maybe 10 steps between me and the edge of the bungee jump. And I took a deep breath and I started coaching myself, just like I would coach my team or the people that I had facilitated in my work. You know, Nicole, fear is just it's an illusion. You know, you just have to push past the fear, breathe deeply. It's going to be okay. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. But I was noticing that in this coaching, in my mind, in this perpetual lamenting, you know, and over-analysis and overthinking, it was becoming more and more difficult to actually move. And so I was forced myself to take a step, forced myself to take another step and another step. And my body was getting more and more contracted. And that's really the nature of fear. And I want you from here on to notice that somatically, that the longer we stay in fear, the longer it takes us to take that leap, the more contracted physiologically and neurologically as well we become. And then I said to him halfway between where I began and the edge of the platform, you know, can you maybe push me, because I really don't know how I'm going to physically do this jump, because for anyone that's bungee jumped, you have to actually take the jump yourself. And it's like, this is the most unnatural thing for anyone to do. This is everything in your body and your brain is telling you, do not do this. And he answered again in broken English, no, that's dangerous. And I think I said, yeah, no shit, brother. Sorry for the language. And then I realized I was going to have to do this. And I looked back and my Spanish friend was cheering me on from the sideline. And my brain started to get more and more ridiculous. You know, it starts to think things like, you know what, I probably didn't turn the PowerPoint off in my hotel room. I have to go back immediately. This is the priority, you know, and just notice how our brain does that the longer we hesitate. And then it really dawned on me, you know, Nick, the longer you hesitate, the longer you stay in your head, the longer you contemplate and overanalyze, actually the harder it's going to get. And I couldn't handle it getting any harder. And it was as if something came over me in that moment, and I took the leap. And of course, as soon as you take the leap, the fear becomes this euphoria. The fear becomes this feeling of total expansiveness, right? And as I was on the way down, I think I blacked out maybe for a couple of seconds, but other than that, I remember having this radical epiphany about fear, even though this was an interest of mine my entire life, it landed in a much deeper way. I recognized that when I was standing on the precipice of that bungee jump, I was convincing myself that the scariest bit was going to be the moment I jumped. And isn't that so true to all of the things that terrify us, all the action we don't take, all the actions we don't take, all the conversations we're too afraid to have with the people we love, or our investors, or our business partners, or honesty with ourselves. We think that the action itself is the scariest bit. And so we hesitate, holding ourselves in that moment right before the jump. And what I realized beyond any doubt after this experience was people can spend their whole life on that edge, believing that they're keeping themselves safe. And the irony is that choice and attachment to live in fear actually holds us in the scariest bit. Because as soon as we take that leap, all of that fear turns to power, turns to potential, turns to a frequency and a vibration of expansion and love. And ever since then, I've really enjoyed sharing the story. But more importantly, I've recognized just how short our life really is, and how deceptive fear really can be. And the saying, the only thing to fear is fear itself, really started to make sense on a deeper level as well. Because holding ourselves in that fear really is as scary as it's ever going to be. The second you cultivate the courage, the real courage to take those leaps, your life not only expands, but everything about what was contracting you and controlling you instantly dissipates, regardless of the outcome. And I think that's the thing that really I'd love to share with all of you today is we're so outcome focused as a society. We're so driven by how we expect things to go, and often so disappointed if reality doesn't match up. The irony is that pressure, when we put ourselves in that state of fear, everything in our system is working against us. But when we can take these leaps and be expansive and trust, and even more than trust, have faith in ourselves, faith in the process, faith in the courage that you've needed to cultivate to take those actions, whatever happens, even if it's not what you believed was going to happen, there is a safety net there to catch you. And can we fall in love as entrepreneurs or as change makers or leaders of any kind? Can we fall in love with the growth of those defining moments more than put pressure on the expected outcome? And what I've recognized in my journey, and also in the work I've done with people, that seesaw, when we fall more in love with the growth that we cultivate during the journey of entrepreneurship, the invitation to stretch our parameters, the invitation to go above and beyond and meet ourselves in new ways, when we fall in love with that, and the fact that we get to do that as leaders with the people that are around us, the people that we influence, the people that, you know, we hold the keys for in so many ways, just like Kelly has for me today. If we fall in love with that more than the expectation of how it's all going to look, I think this is where true resilience comes from. And when I was asked to speak, and I asked Kelly what value, you know, could I share the most with this group, that's really what I heard in some of what Kelly had reflected. Because it really is the courage and the love and the faith that creates that resilience. I think resilience has become a bit of a buzzword in so many ways, and potentially through that trend has become slightly misunderstood. Now, I see nature as the most resilient demonstration of anything that we have in our world, and nature doesn't try to hold on nature lets go. If you live somewhere other than Australia, the trees in winter, the leaves fall. And the leaves fall because by design, the tree knows it can trust that spring's going to come and there's going to be a new bloom. And the waves in the ocean travel infinite distances just to crash on the shore and do it all again. And this flow is simultaneously available to us. And yet it's a conversation that I feel is so often lacking from the entrepreneurial community because of the pressures. Rose, who I was in the breakout group with, one of her very relevant questions was, what do you do when an investor is putting pressure on you to drive outcomes? Well, can you have enough confidence and belief that ultimately at the end of the day, if someone has invested in you, who you really are, your nature, to be strong in the face of those pressures, to hold your ground, to have open dialogue and know how to listen, but also know how to fundamentally believe in yourself when that matters most. This type of resilience comes from feeling fully, being present to all possibilities in all moments, not to blocking and avoiding, and miscommunication, I think, has been so core to so many challenges that we all face in our teams, in our communities, in our world. But what really allows us to have these difficult conversations is the very character and nature that this story of the bungee jump taught me. Taking a leap into the unknown and being willing to speak your truth, being willing to be real with the vision you have in the world and take inspired action, inspired literally meaning within your spirit, in spirited action, to not block because we're scared to be seen as imperfect, to not defend because we're afraid to be exposed, but to stay open and open-hearted, open-minded, open-spirited through the entire journey. I have a fundamental belief that if we can cultivate that strength, because that's real strength in that vulnerability, if we can cultivate that strength, wherever our project goes, it's going in a good direction. It allows us to be agile. It allows us to be flexible. I'm sure within your community, you've most likely discussed in entrepreneurship why it's important to have a open mind, to not have a fixed mindset. And what creates a fixed mindset is when we're holding ourselves down for some reason, we're repressing, we don't have a sense of security within us to be able to face the reality of differences sometimes, or challenges sometimes. It's cultivated really the truth of the resilience that we require to handle that comes in the opposite way that I think has been promoted to us societally for so long, that it's strong to withhold, it's strong to defend, but it's so often the opposite. And whenever I get that pushback, which I've had a lot of, in my work, and I've facilitated a lot of leaders that have invested a lot of years into not finding strength in vulnerability, not finding strength in authenticity and truth. And often the biggest pushback is, well, being vulnerable is exposing our weakness, our wounds. But it's in that place, right, that we find true strength. If we refuse to have that, be a part of our journey and our story, then how are we really meant to connect with people? The story that I shared when I first met Kelly was the story of my school principal, who was really the first leader in my life that taught me this through demonstration, not just through words. And it was his demonstration and influence that shaped so much of what I believe is important in entrepreneurship and leadership. As a teenager, I suffered very greatly with an eating disorder. I went to a lot of different schools, and I think a byproduct of probably the copious amounts of change. My PhD was in change by the time I graduated, the equivalent of high school. And And leaving school at 14 to pursue performance, I think the pressures of that and everything combined led to me struggling very greatly with anorexia. And it was interesting going through that experience, which was extremely foundational to the work I do today and the problem I seek to solve in the world. It was interesting going through that experience and seeing the way that society relates to vulnerability. Through the eyes of a 16-year-old, I really believed it was because no one cared about me. I believed it's because I wasn't worthy of people leaning in and having those difficult conversations with me. But of course, as I started to heal, what I started to recognize was the confronting nature of what I was going through, because unlike many invisible scars, which we all have, no one's exempt from the pain of life in one way or another. That's why compassion and kindness is so important. We never know what someone's going through at the end of the day. I can't emphasize that enough. When you've done the sort of listening that I've done with people, you really see that so often we just have no idea what someone's going through. But I didn't understand, as a teenager going through that the way people were reacting to me was way more about their relationship with their own vulnerability than it was what I was going through. But because it was physical, because there was a physical fragility, there was a physical vulnerability, when people would contract, when I would become the elephant in the room, especially when the eating disorder had reached that point of crisis, I now recognize in retrospect that when people were feeling that vulnerability, it was something they couldn't be present with. But I want us to really dissect this, right? Because all of us, I think, are in the business of making the world a better place. And very few, I've found, leaders are ready to take the journey of really making ourselves and our own interiority a better place. And that's where change really needs to begin. That's where it has to begin, actually. Because in the incapacity to feel compassion and presence and love towards ourselves in the most difficult, fragile moments and parts of our own character and the parts of us that we don't feel maybe are lovable, the parts of us that have felt vulnerable or pathetic or weak or whatever your versions of that are, your vulnerabilities, then whenever something or someone appears in our reality that represents those parts of us that we're in rejection of, we can't help but reject what's in front of us. And really realizing this completely shifted my paradigm of what it means to be a leader. I now understand that being a leader is about doing that inner work, knowing that I have that strength of relationship with myself, that I'm no longer threatened by someone else's vulnerability. I'm no longer threatened by someone else's weakness. I'm no longer threatened by someone else's anger or volatility or pain, which allows me to truly lead rather than be reactive. Now, it was during that time that my school principal, of all people, really, he was the most unlikely candidate. He was a middle-aged triathlete principal, right? It's a super alpha dude. I was this aspiring 16-year-old, model and performer. It couldn't have been more worlds apart for him. He was the one that cultivated the strength to have that first conversation with me. And I could tell that he was really quite terrified to have that conversation with me. When he first approached me at school, was after a rehearsal, and that was probably him seeing just how dire my situation had gotten to. And he said through a broken voice, very vulnerable, "Nicole, can you come and have a conversation with me in my office?" And I remember in that moment feeling terror. I remember feeling shame. The irony is, if you had asked me back then, what's the one thing that you would quote for the most, I would have said for someone to really see the pain I was in, because I had no idea how to talk about it. I had no idea how to share it or be vulnerable in the ways that I now know how to be. And I think this is true for so many of us. We think we want someone to see us and hear us. And then as soon as it was there, all I wanted to do was run as fast as I could in the other direction. And I just want to flag that, because I don't think that's just true for our emotional vulnerabilities. I often think that that's true for our dreams and our destiny. You know, in our idea, in our fantasy, it can seem so rich and beautiful and amazing. You know, we meet the love of our life, or we start this incredible venture, and we get the capital for it. And then we actually are met with the realities of what it takes to build amazing relationships, to build amazing businesses, the tenacity, the willingness, the courage. You know, when that sets in, so often we then have this impulse to want to run away. We get scared. And this is the battle between light and dark, right? And I remember feeling that when my principal was very clearly seeing the realities of what I was going through. But lo and behold, I sort of put my tail between my legs, and he had already walked away to get to his office. And I started to walk towards his office, and I was physically shaking because I was so scared. And I opened his office door, and I was so scared and shaken that I couldn't sit on the other side of his desk as you normally would when you went to the principal's office, because the tension I was feeling being in that close proximity to him was too extreme. So I went and sat in the corner of the room. He had quite a big office, and I braced myself, quite literally. I put my hands in my hands over my head, because I was waiting to get yelled at. I was waiting for him to tell me there was something wrong with me. And he held a silence probably for a couple of minutes, but naturally it felt like 2 hours, right? And then he said, "Nicole, I'm not here to make you feel afraid. I just want you to know that you're not alone in going through what you're going through." And I burst out crying, like ugly crying. And I hadn't cried. I hadn't cried through the entirety of that illness. I hadn't let myself actually cry. And I now realize it was because I never felt safe enough to come as I was. Because the byproduct of what I was experiencing was I was holding my own pain and suffering. And because of the way people reacted to that pain and suffering, I simultaneously felt responsible for their discomfort. And I know Kelly has a very strong passion for lifting up marginalized people in our community and those that are vulnerable. And I think this is one of the deepest things I could share on truly supporting those who are vulnerable. You know, often because of our discomfort with that vulnerability, not only do our society's most vulnerable have to deal with their own pain and circumstances, they have to deal with the reaction and the discomfort that comes when others who aren't carrying so much are exposed to their vulnerability. And this is where I believe true generosity of spirit, or what I would call loving out loud, is required. Is not for us to fix people or save people, but do enough work on ourselves that no matter what someone's going through, within reason, we have a relative capacity to normalize that experience. Otherwise, healing is not possible. And that's what my principal did when he said that to me. I was no longer a 16-year-old anorexic. I was a human being that he cared enough about to meet and allow me to be in the fullness of what I was actually experiencing. He invited me to not have to pretend, to not have to hide. And there was this huge release of emotion. And most Aussies, we have a pretty, what we would call an opera culture in that situation, would come over and slap you on the back and say, "Okay, there, stop crying now, you know, that's enough." But he didn't, he just let me cry. And after about 30 minutes, he just sat there and he said, he asked me a question. He said, "Nicole, you know what my favorite thing to do after school is?" And I was still crying, right? So I was like, "Please don't ask me questions," and shaking my head and wiping the snot away from my face. And he said, my favorite thing to do, I've been an educator for 30 years. It's always been my favorite thing, is when I get home, I have a cold beer. And I was confused, right? My first thought, I think, was, are you telling me this is the answer to my problems right now? Or surely not. He got out a piece of paper from his desk and he wrote, as if he was writing a contract, I will not have a beer until you hit your weight target. And he signed it. And he got a piece of sticky tape and he put it on his wall. And I was in disbelief, keeping in mind that at that point in my life, I thought I was invisible. A BB, yeah, probably a 4X. Australians love 4X. BB and 4X. You know, and I thought that I was invisible. So the fact that he would have so much grace to not only see me and allow me to be in the experience that I was in, but actually be willing to meet me halfway in that. He never once said, you clearly are struggling with a mental illness. He never once said, clearly you're anorexic. He just said, I'm willing to give up something that I love for you, to have someone with you on the journey to make the changes you need to make for your health and well-being. And the only thing I could think to muster to say in that moment was, why would you do that for me? And he said, Nicole, I've never been a 16-year-old girl, aspiring performer, just going through this, and I never will be. So I don't understand what that's like. But I do understand what it feels like to be a human that's trying to climb a mountain that feels impossible to get to the top of. And I know what it feels like to be doing that alone. And I just want you to know that you're not alone. And as I shared the first time, when I told Kelly this story, that conversation changed the trajectory of my life and potentially saved my life. And it's not that that conversation was the magic pill. It's not that that conversation happened and then I went home and all of a sudden there was 20 kilos on my body and all of the health complications that came thereafter were fixed. But when he had to do what he had to do, which was get the right support around me and the right authorities involved to make sure that I was doing what I needed to do to save my life, those 2 years were incredibly difficult. Even though I had seen the light, I still had to overcome the terror I felt every time I ate. I still had to learn to see myself as worthy of life and worthy of love. And that was a hard journey. And it was a journey that took constant effort, constant will, and there were many setbacks, just like there is in any recovery process. Sometimes you feel like you take 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. But in all of those doctors' waiting rooms, in all of the times where I felt ostracized by people in my community or misunderstood by therapists, there was someone in the world that was willing to believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And it shaped what I wanted to do in the world very, very deeply. And I questioned, as I was on that path of recovery, what was it that was so transformative about his approach with me? And the number one thing, there were many aspects of that could be a whole, seminar in and of itself, deconstructing the power of that action and that story. But what I came to at its core was he was willing to really listen. And I don't necessarily even mean listen to my words, just listen to what was really required in that moment. So I think so often we put pressure on ourselves again to know the answers, to have it all figured out. Often in the conversation of mental health, the work I've done with communities and families and teams, the number one thing that prevents people from having those conversations and to really listening to one another is the inner dialogue of, what if I get it wrong? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse? What if I'm not the right person? And we don't mean to do this. But what we're actually doing in those moments is we're making someone else's pain about ourselves. And it's not coming from a bad place. I've seen the deepest pain and innocence, you know, in parents that have struggled with the most severe circumstances with their children, for instance, where they're just not able to breathe and take a step back because they're so affected by that other person's pain. And I think herein lies some of the most tragic miscommunication we see as a world, that when we're feeling someone else's pain, because we're naturally empathetic creatures, through our evolutionary process, we needed each other to survive. So everything about our chemical and hormonal makeup, seminar for another time, is wired towards connection. The oxytocin we feel when we're in a proximity to one another, the serotonin we feel when we're proud of someone else in our community. This is not just a coincidence. This is an intelligent design which communicates very clearly that we're meant to be together. We're not meant to be separate. We weren't the strongest animal. We weren't the fastest animal. We were the best at working together. We were the best at cooperating. And so because of that nature, and because we live, at least this is what I've discovered, in a culturescape and a society that so often doesn't have these conversations, doesn't make it okay for that sensitivity and love and compassion to lead, we don't realize that this reaction that makes it so difficult for us to breathe and act compassionately and respond to the pain that's around us is actually because we don't know how to handle the pain ourselves. And so we have, for the most part, an entire society of people that care deeply, but are doing whatever they can to desensitize the pain that they really feel day to day. And the expense of that is disconnection. The expense of that is an unwillingness to hear people that believe different things to us. Now, when we extend our ears and our presence and our heart to someone that believes different things to us, it's not a threat to our existence. We can simultaneously see the world the way we see the world and be open to the fact that others may have a different perspective to us. That's possible. And think if that was truly applied in the grandest of ways, how much of a revolution that would truly be. Simple, but extremely revolutionary. In my journey from that moment onward, I made the decision to dedicate my life to really supporting people to listen and to love, and to have that be the starting point of all of our pursuits, no matter what area of life. And that took me on a crazy, crazy adventure. At 18, I bought a van and I traveled to 300 communities around Australia for 2 years, which was, in the beginning, extremely hard going, right? This was before there were celebrities and sports players and all of these influential ambassadors talking about mental health, you know, in communities that were very remote and rural for the most part. And in the very beginning, I'd have, you know, 2, 3, 4 people rock up to these workshops and events, and we'd host them in the library if the community had one. Sometimes we'd do it in a yarning circle with the elders of the community. Sometimes we'd do it at the schools. And the level of resistance to having these conversations was so immense. There was a time that I got out of my van and I was spat on by one of the locals because they knew that I was there to talk about this kind of subject matter. But again, I remember when that happened, I had the awareness, because of what I had been through and what was shown to me, that person's pain was not personal. So who was I going to be in that moment? Was I going to react and say, F you? Or was I going to recognize that I'm representing something that's really hurt that person? And if I can stay calm and not take it personally, there's a real opportunity for healing here. And it was really that tenacity and that belief that allowed those 4 people to become 10, to become 20, to become 50, to become entire schools. And so therein was the real movement had begun even before Love Out Loud existed. And it was really fascinating because the way that as the work grew and the interest grew, that myself, and at that point I had a small team of 3 other people that I brought on to support the facilitation of the communities. We started to see that the first 5,000 people we worked with, it was almost like, wow, it's a real coincidence in that even though all these people are so different, when we really get down to it, they want the same thing. And then 10,000 people, 20,000 people, 30,000 people, we started to realize, okay, this isn't a coincidence. Actually, regardless of your status or your age or your gender or your position of power or how much money you have in your bank or your level of education, if you really get past all of the aspects of identity to the core of that human heart, it's all the same. There is so much more of what makes us the same than what separates us. And we started to recognize that we weren't experts in, we were calling our work community capacity building. We weren't experts in building roads. We weren't experts in, building schools. We were experts in bridging the differences. And as the work started to grow and we had entire communities of thousands wanting us to work with them, the way that I was facilitating that change was to first spend deep time. I'd often be in a community for weeks at a time with each of the community stakeholders. So the school students, the parents, like the police, the services, the teachers, all separately, and just listen. That was not a time for us to put our ideas of what needed to happen forward. It was a time to just listen. And lo and behold, the police would say it's the parents' fault because the parents don't parent the kids properly, and the parents would say it's the teacher's fault because they're not supervising the kids properly, and the kids would say no one understands us, and it's everyone's fault, But when we really got underneath all of the blame to the core need, the need was universal. The need was, I care so much, but I don't feel heard, and I don't feel appreciated, and I don't feel seen, and I don't know how to get past the differences that create the constant miscommunication. And so rather than having these revolutionary ideas of how these communities were going to heal, we would just bring the communities together after all this listening had happened, and we would relay everything that we heard. That's what we would do. This is what we heard. And a once extremely divided community, as if by some magic and miracle, we're hugging and crying and sharing and acknowledging and building bridges. When we realize we're not each other's enemy, when we realize fundamentally as humankind, we're actually on the same team. I've experienced very, very, very few, I could probably count them on maybe one hand, of all the people I've ever listened to that I truly believe at the core have malice intent. We're all doing what we believe is right. And so many of us don't have the skills to express ourselves, to allow ourselves to feel loved and received and understood. And the pain of the accumulation of that on a collective scale creates so much division that fundamentally doesn't actually have any weight when we get to the core of what we're all seeking and wanting. And it inspired me to realize that this is a code. This is a universal truth. And when I finally did take that trip around the world and did the bungee jump, by that point, the Australian government, after creating or co-founding the Parliamentary Friends of Youth Mental Health, which was a parliamentary group that basically allowed conversations happening between the nonprofit sector and the government sector to communicate. People thought that I was very radical for wanting to bring, the very simple message of love to politicians and say, hey, we're spending billions of dollars trying to solve this problem, but it's literally getting worse every year. So maybe there's some deeper considerations that we need to look at here. And it was the launch of that parliamentary friendship group that then created the invitation to work as a federal commissioner, you know, and to go from working in communities in that way to then advising a $30 billion budget for mental health, and sitting in those boardrooms and recognizing these guys, you know, these 6 to 10 decision makers are dealing with the same stuff that 13-year-old kid was dealing with in the community, in the community center that I was working with out west. It looked so different, you know, the wrapping was so different, but the dispute, the conflict, the miscommunication, the incapacity to actually speak truth and be vulnerable and build a bridge, it was the same. And I used to sit there and marvel at how we can develop entirely sophisticated systems and still be missing these very important foundations. And it really made me realize, especially as an entrepreneur, looking at a budget like this, right? We can give billions of dollars to systems that by default are built on foundations of fear, that don't have the right level of leadership when it comes to all that we're discussing today. And although it looks like a lot's happening, the true, sustainable, fundamental change is still missing. It made me realize that we can give all of the world's resources to a solution that was birthed from the same place as the problem, and just end up with more problems. And I think some of the best minds in the world, the best leaders and prophets on our planet that have walked the earth have told us change has to happen from within. But what does that really mean in practice? You know, I believe that when we get these foundations correct and we start to create from a new place of possibility, a new place of willingness, of love and compassion, it's here that true change can start to move. And so that's really been my lifelong obsession. And in working at that level, all the way through to the community level, I really did start to recognize that there's a technology that is already within us, but so many of us don't realize it. So the question became, what if we were to really create a technology that shows people the truth of what happens when our system is coherent, when we're able to determine the limitations and the blocks that we experience in our bodies from fear and trauma, in our subconscious mind from the programming of society? What if we could actually locate what was preventing us from being fully coherent and aligned to these ideals and values that so many of us say we're aligned to, but on some subconscious or somatic level, it still remains difficult for us to show up in the world with true integrity? What if there was a technology that allowed us to actually achieve that level of integrity? How could that start to change the world from the inside out? It was that fascination that really began driving me in a very full-on way. It was a curiosity that I couldn't really let go of, seeing that the work I had been doing up until that point, and then writing Love Out Loud and working with people through the Love Out Loud methodology, which was the accumulation of that 8 or 9 years of discovery, putting that into a methodology and seeing the transformation that was happening when people really started to embody that understanding in so many different avenues of life. I started to see that there were these fundamental markers that when I was facilitating someone, for instance, and I was supporting them to go to the edges of something that was scary for them, or a belief that was edgy for them to let go of. You know, when our beliefs are challenged, our belief systems, we go into a state of cognitive dissonance. You know, if you believe something very strongly and then something happens that shows you that belief might not be true, it is very difficult for our consciousness to handle that, because we can't believe 2 things at once. And so we can only make 2 choices in that. We can make a choice to reject what's in front of us. And that's often what people choose, because it's the easier thing. It's a thing that doesn't require us to stretch as much. And then we walk around, with our fingers in our ears and our hands over our eyes because we don't want to be challenged on the things that we believe about the world. Or we can be willing to let go of that limiting belief and open our mind to a broader possibility. When I was facilitating people, this was always the moment of transformation. When these people were hearing each other, the parents believed that the teachers were the enemy, and the teachers were there saying, but I want the same things you want. What was happening to those parents was their beliefs were being stretched and challenged. And there were very visible and very universal markers that would indicate whether or not someone was at a point of capacity to extend themselves to believe something new. And this was really where I started to ideate the technology that Love Out Loud's currently working on, by being able to evaluate biomarkers like brain activity, like the activity in our heart, like the amount of tensions in our muscle against a stimulus, like a belief system or a desired outcome. So maybe in a team, the desired outcome is to have a loving, kind culture, or maybe it's something a bit more arbitrary, like drive an increase of 10% in revenue in the next quarter. But whenever a human being is exposed to a stimulus, the intelligence in our mind and the intelligence in our body is actually communicating how we truly feel about that, how much capacity we really have to go to that next place of evolution, in my language, to extend into love and possibility over fear and rejection and contraction. This is all happening within us all the time. So the product that we're creating at the moment gives a pathway for people to become objectively conscious of that, so that these default moments where we've potentially rejected that possibility, rejected newness, rejected love, can be moments that we choose something different. We choose to regulate ourselves. We choose to take a deep breath. We choose to expand into those possibilities. This to me is where we really, really start to unlock true human potential. In all moments, our societal fabrics are held together by collective agreements. And that can be a really radical thing for people to wake up to, because we're so used to blaming the system. But what is the system? The system, bureaucracy is a series of agreements and decisions and relationships. And so all of us have a power, to show up differently in that. But so often we don't see the pathway to be able to, because we're not able to see ourselves properly. So what does that look like? When a technology exists that makes it as simple as being able to put or stipulate a belief system or a desired goal statement into an app and actually see your level of coherence against that, and in real time align your system completely to a place of calmness and what I would call integrity with that statement. So everything that happens thereafter behaviorally through your action becomes easier. Are we going to be able to mobilize thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to new possibilities? Remembering that eventually the goal is to help people realize that we don't even need external technology to support us to do this. The ultimate realization is to help people understand that this has always been within you, that potential. But because our attention's been so hijacked in so many different directions, we've been fragmented. We've lost connection to that personal power. I dream of a time where our tech is at a point of ease of use, where if something radical was to be announced, like say God forbid, nuclear war, we could instantaneously unify enough people to align to a statement like, I live in a peaceful world, and use the power of our consciousness, our frequency, to actually make it on a subconscious and energetic level impossible for that reality to manifest. And it sounds radical, but actually this is it's been proven in more analog manual ways many times. There have been times where there have been mass global meditations, and it's been assessed, you know, for 48, 72 hours and beyond afterwards, the crime rates have gone to basically nil. That death and disease diagnoses in certain parts of the world have decreased rapidly. So what is that? You know, I've never seen these deeper understandings of the human spirit and our true potential as sovereign individuals as separate to science. I think it's just a world that is still learning to speak each other's language. And I really believe in the next decade, we're going to see a massive, well, I hope, we're going to see a massive convergence of these two understandings. Because I believe that that's really where we start to see change, like the change I'm passionate about, the change that I've shared with you today, when we're going to start to see that scale, when we're going to start to see entire countries be able to mobilize more towards self-actualization and compassion. One of the challenges, I think, has been that there have been incredible teachers on our planet, amazing prophets, and to some degree, you know, amazing neuroscientists that have shared similar messages about our makeup and our truth. But there hasn't been a system that supported the organization of that on a collective level. And so it's the last 2 years ideating that and researching how to bring that to life has definitely been, I would say, the next edge for me in my entrepreneurial journey. It's something that I'm obsessed with. And it's definitely something I would love to share with all of you in one way or another, if that's of interest. But yeah, I've shared a lot with you guys, and I know we only have another 10 minutes, so I'd love to create space if there's dialogue or questions or sharing, to invite that into the space before we finish up.
Yes, please. Folks, if Nicole, thank you. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. There was a couple conversations in the Zoom chat. Nicole, I took a bunch of notes, and I just have to thank you. One thing, I want to read a quote from a book called Unleashed, and it was written by one of the Harvard Business School professors, Frances Frye, and her wife, Ann Morris. Quote, "People go higher, further, faster in your presence because they experience your conviction about what's possible for them." And Frances refers to that person as a superhero. And I think you're one of the first people I've ever met that I can actually say, yeah, I now have a picture of what a superhero looks like. And I just want to thank you.
Okay, thank
I
you.
was just going to end the recording and we can hang out for overtime. Please fill out the survey when you exit Zoom this evening. Just lastly, next week, Tracy Warren from F5 Collective. Then we've got Dolly Singh, Allison Byers, and we've got an amazing workshop on de-risking the business model. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to end the recording now. I will see you all next week.